The fried liver attack arises from the Italian game, which is one of the most popular openings. After the initial moves, we reach this position, knight to f6 by black, and now comes the surprising move knight to g5, targeting the vulnerable pawn on f7. The main response by black is pawn to d5, challenging the center. After the exchange of pawns, there's a very common mistake by black, the natural-looking recapture with the knight on d5. Here comes the key tactical shot. Knight takes the pawn on f7. This is the fried liver attack. It's called that because you're supposedly frying your opponent quickly with this sharp idea. After king takes the knight on f7, white plays queen to f3, setting up serious threats. It might look like black is about to get crushed, but the position is actually much more complex than it seems at first glance. My promise is this. By the end of this analysis, you will understand the fried liver attack better than 99% of your opponents. So now, queen to f3. Check. What can black do here? Their king is in check, so they absolutely have to respond. Retreating back to g8 is a terrible idea. It leads to an instant checkmate, basically, on the next move. A complete disaster. Going back to e8 isn't much better. After bishop to d5, white threatens queen to f7 checkmate, while also putting pressure on the pawn on c6. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, the most commonly played move here by black is knight to d4, trying to create counterplay. But it actually blunders into what is essentially a forced checkmate. At this point, you might be thinking, it's all over. White is clearly winning, right? Not quite. Black has this bold and brave move, king to e6. Now, the black king really takes matters into his own hands, as if saying, if you want it done right, do it yourself. Yes, the king is completely exposed, but on the other hand, black keeps their extra knight on d5. Now it's up to white to prove compensation for the knight sacrificed earlier on f7. If white can't find a concrete way to punish the exposed king, black might actually complete development and end up winning the game, all thanks to their material advantage. Now how can white continue the attack from here? Well, the first move is quite clear. The black king is exposed and the knight on d5 is pinned, so white plays knight to c3, adding even more pressure to the pinned knight. What can black do in response? White's idea is simple, to capture the knight on d5 and keep attacking. So black must find a way to defend the knight, and there are really only two ways to do that, either by moving another knight forward to protect it, or retreating a knight to defend from behind. Back in the day, players weren't sure which defensive move was better. Many, even grandmasters, chose to play knight to e7, trying to defend the knight from behind. But eventually, it became clear that this wasn't a good option. Why? Because although knight to e7 does guard the knight on d5, it's a passive move. It blocks the bishop and the queen, limiting black's coordination and development, definitely not ideal. On the other hand, the move knight to b4 also defends the knight on d5, but it does so while simultaneously counterattacking. That's what makes it much stronger. In fact, this move brings a tactical threat. Knight to c2, which would be a fork, attacking both the king and the rook at the same time. So, white also needs to be a bit careful about the potential threat of knight to c2, which would fork the king and rook. But the simplest and most effective way to deal with this is just to castle. By castling, white moves the king out of danger from any potential check on c2, which means knight to c2 would now be a terrible move. It leaves the knight on d5 completely undefended. So white simply captures the knight on d5 and keeps the attack going. That way, white not only solves the threat, but also plays a useful developing move. Now, black finally gets some breathing room and plays pawn to c6, trying to stabilize the position and protect the knight on d5. Black's idea is, hey, I'm still up a piece. Now it's your job to prove that you've got enough compensation. Can you really checkmate my king? And white says, all right, challenge accepted. White responds with pawn to d4, a powerful move. The idea is clear. Open up the e-file and bring heavy pieces into the attack. That's why capturing the pawn on d4 is probably far too dangerous for black. White would immediately activate the rook to the open e-file and begin a direct assault on the centralized king. Now, beginners in this position often fall for the idea of capturing the pawn on c2 with the knight, thinking it's a clever fork. But the problem is, black is just wasting time while being completely undeveloped, and their king is stuck in the center. This is not a good strategy at all. And honestly, white doesn't even have to worry about the rook being attacked. The position is already overwhelmingly strong. Got it. White plays pawn to e5, opening the e-file. After black captures the rook, white responds with rook to d1, creating strong pressure. Black's position becomes overloaded and full of tactical threats, with checkmate looming. To defend, black plays queen to f6, offering a queen trade to reduce the attack. but white avoids it with queen to e2, maintaining pressure and reinforcing the pin on the e-file, especially against the pawn on e5. The attack continues, and black remains under serious threat. Now white is putting strong pressure on the pawn on e5, and because of the pin, black can't even respond with something like pawn to f4. White can simply play pawn to a3, kicking out the knight on b4, which has no good retreat squares. With the black king still exposed, it looks like black's position is about to collapse. But once again, black finds a precise defensive move. King to e7. At first glance, it looks risky. The king stays in the center, directly across from the white queen, and it also blocks the bishop on f8. Still, it's a brilliant idea that makes it harder for white to continue attacking. So what's the purpose of this move? Mainly, black wants to step out of the pin from the white bishop and prepare to trade knights. And as always, if you're ahead in material, trading pieces is often the best way to reduce your opponent's attacking chances. The move also clears the way for black's bishop to enter the game. Of course, the downside is that the pawn on e5 is now undefended. White grabs it with tempo, attacking the queen, which moves to g6, creating some counter threats and still hoping to trade knights. But white calmly plays knight to e4, solving everything. This blocks the queen's diagonal, protects the pawn on d2, and prepares new threats like bishop to g5 check or knight to d6, keeping black under pressure. Black responds with bishop to f5, attacking the knight on e4. White defends it, keeping the pressure. Now should black capture on e4? Not really. If black takes, white will recapture with the pawn, forcing the knight on d5 to move and opening the f-file for white's rook, which would only strengthen white's attack. So that's not ideal for black. Instead, black needs a smarter plan, and this is where prophylactic thinking comes in. Black has to ask, what is white likely to do next? Well, white would probably play pawn to a3 or pawn to c3 to kick the knight on b4, which has no good squares. If forced to retreat, it would go to a6, where it's completely passive. Worse still, white could choose to capture it and ruin black's pawn structure. To avoid all that, black plays knight to b6, a clever move that serves two purposes. First, it gives the knight on d5 an escape square if needed. Second, it prepares to trade off white's active bishop on c4. Seeing this idea, white wisely retreats the bishop to b3, preserving it for future threats. Black has avoided immediate threats, but there are still issues. The king is centralized, the bishop can't develop, and the rooks are stuck. Black needs a plan to solve these problems. In response, black plays a brilliant move, king to d7. It's a counterintuitive decision. Placing the king along the open d-file seems risky, but it's a fantastic idea. After rook to d1 check, black's king simply moves to c7, finding a safe spot. Now black is ready to develop the bishop and rook, while also reminding white that black is still up a piece. At this point, the pressure is on white. They need to prove they can maintain the attack, or else black will gain the upper hand. White responds with a pawn sacrifice. Pawn to e6. Black could capture the pawn, but doing so would lead to disaster. If pawn to e6 is taken, white's bishop can come to life with a check. The rook controls the file, forcing the king to move, and after knight to d6, white has too many threats and is winning.